The party switch is a lie told to you by the left to fool you into voting for the Democratic Party. We should all know that today's Republican Party is still the party of Lincoln, and that anyone who tells you otherwise is a liar. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions and mistakes when people make when talking about the party switch, but there's only one lie, and that lie is that it never happened. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions because people will say there was only one. In my research, there have been multiple ideological shifts in the two parties. The Democratic Party has undergone more than the Republican. A lot of that is because it's been around longer. So at first, under Jackson and Van Buren, the Democratic Party was essentially a fiscally liberal party, but social conservative. And then with James Polk and Franklin Pierce, it was just straight up conservative. Now, they believed in low taxes and and social inequality. And then with the Republican Party, it was founded on liberal values. Abraham Lincoln was more of a moderate. He basically said, now is not the time to free the slaves. He was basically like a Dwight Eisenhower. He was not a Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan, and especially a Richard Nixon. And far from a Donald Trump. So when did the Democratic Party become the Liberal Party, and when did the Republican Party become the Conservative Party? It started around like the late 1800s when William Jennings Bryan adopted Populist Party platforms. The reason the Populist Party formed was because many individuals and politicians felt the Republican Party was straying away from the values of Lincoln and Stevens and Grant. And so William Jennings Bryan, when he ran for president, he decided he would adopt these platforms and get populist voters to vote for the Democrats. Now, he was unsuccessful in all of his elections, but he did blur party lines to the point where liberals would start moving over to the Democratic Party. Already, to escape the ideological battle in the Republican Party, you had the stalwarts, which were the Ruther B. Hayes and Chester Arthurs, and then you had the half-breeds, which were your James Garfields and Ulysses Grant. And then the purebreds, which were the Abraham Lincolns and the Thaddeus Stevens, more so Thaddeus Stevens. You could argue that Lincoln was a half-breed. But these forces were conflicting in the Republican Party, and that's why the Populist Party had formed. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt had established that the Republican Party was the Progressive Party, and he had basically brought the Republican Party further to the left. And then he chose Taft to be his successor. Now, Taft started out as a good, strong progressive. He actually busted more trusts than Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt busted 40, Taft busted 70. Now, Taft doesn't get a lot of attention because around the end of his presidency, he started to shift in this neoliberal, moderate, I wouldn't call it moderate, more neoliberal direction. And that is why Taft formed the Progressive Party. And in 1912, the Progressive Party's traction began to build up. And so the Democrats, with Woodrow Wilson, decided, we're going to take some of these progressive platforms. But as you can see, Roosevelt came in second to Wilson, and Wilson carried some Republican strongholds in the election by adopting some of Roosevelt's platforms. And for the most part, Woodrow Wilson governed as a progressive. He was not so progressive on African American rights issues, and I'm being nice there, but he was progressive on economic issues and foreign. And what happened afterwards was that ideological battle that was taking place in the Republican Party began to start taking place in the Democratic Party. There were still some extremely liberal Republicans at the time. Later on, Dwight Eisenhower, very liberal. But for the most part, a lot of these progressives had started to move over to the Democratic Party. And essentially, like at the time, the Republican Party was libertarian. Basically, they were socially liberal and fiscally progressive. I mean, fiscally conservative. You know, and Calvin Coolidge is a libertarian icon, a positive influence in the party. Barry Goldwater is not a very positive libertarian figure. But with Franklin Roosevelt, you had the progressives, the liberals, and the Dixiecrats, the conservatives. And one thing I noticed is that all three of his vice presidents were from the three factions in the party. John Garner, his first one, was a conservative. His second, Henry Wallace, was a progressive. And his third, Harry Truman, which ended up being president, was a liberal. Now, FDR had a difficult job of appeasing all those bases. For example, FDR proposed an anti-lynching law when he was president. It did not pass through Congress. It was rejected by Congress. But at the same time, FDR did not invite Jesse Owens to the White House. And he proposed the anti-lynching law to appease the progressives and the liberals, and then rejected Jesse Owens to appease the conservatives. He did not want the Democratic Party to end up basically falling apart, which is what happened in 1948, and the liberals won that ideological battle. And let's put it this way, the Dixiecrats were de-aligning with the Democratic Party, and then later on they would eventually align with the Republican Party. But as you can see, FDR won over people of all walks of life, liberal, progressive, regressive, in his first election. Now a lot of that was because Hoover was an economic disaster, and he mishandled the Great Depression, and FDR was here to save the day. But as you can see, his second election was an even greater win. This was after the successes of the New Deal, and he was successfully bringing unemployment and whatnot down. However, and you see in his third and fourth election, this comes after court packing when the Supreme Court ruled the first New Deal unconstitutional. His political rivals used it as fear-mongering mechanics, and that the court striking the New Deal down is what prolonged the Great Depression until World War II, and all the other opposition, from basically the rich people like Prescott Bush, who tried to overthrow him. But FDR did have equal employment benefits in his New Deal, which helped minorities. FDR desegregated the military, the ground troop branch, when black soldiers were forced to give up their seats to Nazis. So he did do some great things as president, and why. And so that is why he is remembered as one of our greatest. Because he was able to improve the economy, and he led the U.S. through World War II, and in many ways helped defeat the Nazis. But, moving back to why the party switched, FDR was able to successfully maintain people who supported his cousin, TR, in the Democratic Party. And these were people who were leaving the Republican Party because Teddy Roosevelt was encouraging them to leave to vote for the Progressive Party. But Woodrow Wilson basically decided to adopt some of their platforms and get the progressive voters to vote Democrat and bring progressives into the Democratic Party. Now, all of these presidents have made questionable decisions, but every president has done something terrible. And yes, even Lincoln has done some terrible things during his presidency. But I will get to those, the ups and downs of all of our great presidents, and talk about some of our awful presidents, like George W. Bush, who I consider worse than Donald Trump. But progressives became Democrats because of Franklin Roosevelt, and so did liberals. And since Franklin Roosevelt was such a strong leader, that helped the Democratic Party in many ways. But his death would ultimately result in the division in the Democratic Party, which was brought on by his vice president, Harry Truman. And this would ultimately lead to why conservatives are now Republicans. And so, moving on to 1948, we'll see what happens. Let's put it this way. Truman decided he did not want the Jacksonians in the Democratic Party anymore. Moving on to 1948. Now, this is the year that Harry Truman spoke at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was the very first sitting U.S. president to speak at the NAACP. And in his speech, he condemned racism and promoted the message of civil rights. This created a massive de-alignment of the Democratic Party from conservatives. As you can see, Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and South Carolina were won by Strom Thurmond. He was a third-party candidate of the Dixiecratic Party, the States' Rights Party, or whatever you want to call it. But he won the most racist states in the country. Henry Wallace also splintered from the Democratic Party with the Second Progressive Party. Wallace carried the same amount of the popular vote and national vote as did Thurmond, but he did not win an isolated area of the country like Thurmond, so Wallace carried no electoral votes or states. I would like to also point out Thomas Dewey was actually a fairly progressive candidate. He supported a lot of the same things Truman and Wallace supported. Now, the reason Wallace, one of the biggest downfalls to Wallace's candidacy, is he was a little too sympathetic to communism, which Dewey and Truman were not. And Thurmond was definitely not a proponent of sympathy towards communism. But this does go to show that Dixiecrats were de-aligning with the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party had started supporting civil rights with Harry Truman and Hubert Humphrey. And that is why Dixiecrats began to leave the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party was heading to the left, and Thurmond and the Dixiecrats were right-wing. Leave the Democratic Party. Truman desegregated the military branches that weren't desegregated by FDR. Now, the 50s were an interesting time. In many ways, progressives are feeling what conservatives did in the 50s now. Now, progressives are not being represented by either major party. And basically in the 50s, that was the case for conservatives, because Dwight Eisenhower was a strong liberal candidate. I wouldn't necessarily call him a progressive, but he was definitely left-wing. And so conservatives begrudgingly voted Democrat in the Eisenhower elections. And in fact, a Alabama electorate actually sent a faithless electoral vote to a judge because Adlai Stevenson II was not a deep right-wing candidate. And he pretty much only won the South because Dixiecrats begrudgingly voted Democrat, or they begrudgingly voted Republican. But point being, conservatives were not represented by a major party. Now we get to the part where Republicans start contradicting themselves. So, this is the 1960 election of JFK. And as you can see, JFK lost Alabama and Mississippi to Harry Byrd, who, by the way, wasn't even running for president. Byrd also got votes from Oklahoma. But, as you can see, Nixon and Kennedy were not popular in those states. Now, Nixon neglected the issue of civil rights. So Kennedy won the support of many great civil rights groups because he said, "I am not satisfied until every American enjoys the same rights as a white boy." And he was a strong supporter of civil rights and a very strong progressive. His brother Bobby was an even stronger progressive. I like to see how Republicans would actually try to say, if Kennedy were alive, he'd be a Republican. But you would know the kings of contradiction contradict themselves on the party switch and JFK. Now, JFK supported a 65% top marginal tax rate. He actually was the one who came up with Medicare, and Medicaid. Two programs Republicans hate. Yes, they were signed into law by LBJ, but those were Kennedy's programs. In fact, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Acts were actually Kennedy's bills. Yes, they were signed into law by LBJ as well. In fact, the Civil Rights Act passed while Kennedy was in Dallas. Yes, he died before he could sign it, and there were some changes made afterwards to appease LBJ, and there was great wonders if LBJ, since he was a Southerner, would support the bill. Luckily, LBJ did support the bill. He was among the 3 senators who refused to sign the Southern Manifesto after Brown versus Board of Education. I'll get into the Southern Manifesto in another video. But it was Kennedy's work that brought us the Civil Rights Act. In fact, he actually helped plan the March on Washington and contributed ideas to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But his brother Bobby was actually a member of the Civil Rights Movement, and he took over King's position after King was killed. Now we get to 1964. Lyndon Johnson versus Barry Goldwater. This was the first election where the Republicans tried to reach out to conservative Dixiecrats. This was the election where the Republicans ran Barry Goldwater, who largely opposed Kennedy's advances in civil rights and opposed the Civil Rights Act. Now he claims that he's defending businesses. Whether or not you believe that whether or not that's true is left unknown, but he largely opposed the Civil Rights Act nonetheless, and that's what made him so appealing to racist Southern whites. Which is funny to me, because that was the whole reason Kennedy chose Johnson. to be his running mate was to appeal to Southerners. That's why Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson to be his running mate, was to balance the ticket to appeal to the Southern whites. It's just the irony. But let's look at the map again. As you can see, Goldwater won the deepest southern states, Mississippi and Alabama, which lost Kennedy lost in 1960, and Truman lost in 1948. He won these states by appealing to racist Southern white voters by saying that civil rights is unconstitutional. But at the same time, Goldwater lost support of the North and the blacks. 94% of black voters voted for Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So Goldwater pretty much predominantly won white voters. And actually, Goldwater is the reason Jackie Robinson became a Democrat, and Martin Luther King told his supporters not to support Barry Goldwater. Now I know what you idiot Republicans will say. Well, 80% of Republicans in the House supported it, and 82% of Republicans in the Senate supported it. Only 63% of Democrats supported it, and 69% of Democrats supported it in the House. Well, yeah, it doesn't take rocket science to know that 153 is a bigger number than 136, and 46 is a bigger number than 27. That's because the Democrats had a supermajority. Well, let's look at Union state versus Confederate state. 90% of Senate representatives from Union states voted in favor of the bill. 92% of senators from Union states supported the bill. Only 8% of representatives from Confederate states supported the bill, and 5% from Confederate state senators supported the bill. 95% of Democrats from Union states in the House supported it, and 98% of Democrats from Union states supported the bill. 85% of Republicans from Union states supported the bill, and 84% of Republicans from Union states supported the bill. And 9% of Democrats from Confederate states supported the bill, and 5% of Democrats supported the bill. Oh, would you look at that? Republicans from Confederate states. 0% of Republicans from Confederate states supported the bill. It's pretty telling that all the support from Confederate states came from Democrats. Not a single Southern Republican supported the bill. Credit to Northern Republicans for supporting the Civil Rights Bill. But Northerners were largely liberal, and Southerners were largely conservative. So, the reason that this misleading 80% of Republicans supported the bill, and only 63% supported the bill, floats around is because Democrats had a larger population in southern states. 8. So, granted, the opposition would look larger because there were more Democrats holding office in southern states, whereas Republicans were largely northern. So, granted, since it's a northern issue, liberal northerners voted in favor of the bill and northern progressives, while southern conservative and progressives voted against it. So, let's have a little recap before I get into the Southern strategy. The Dixiecratic de-alignment started with Harry Truman and was further cemented by John F. Kennedy. And Dixiecrats began to hate the Democratic Party. And that's why the Republicans started to gain traction in the South, is because of Kennedy and Truman largely supporting civil rights. And then when Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Bill into law, he famously said, "We lost the South for a generation." Not, "I will keep those niggers voting Democrat for the next 200 years. There's no proof that he said that. Now, I would like to address that one Democrat who switched at 1964 when the bill passed. Now, a lot of Dixiecrats switched parties prior, and a lot of them switched afterwards. Now, not many of them switched right when the bill passed. And so that is why it is misleading when people say, only one switched when the bill passed. Yeah, when the bill passed. None of the others switched when the bill passed. Yeah, when the bill passed. So, how is it that the 1948 Dixiecratic presidential candidate remained in office until he died as a Republican at the age of 100? If South Carolina became so tolerant when it became Republican, how did the 1948 Dixiecrat presidential candidate remain in office until he died? And Lindsey Graham isn't that much more tolerant. And so we come to 1968, the year that Richard Nixon runs for president again and utilizes the Southern strategy. I'll get to that in just a second. But this was also the year that Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were killed. Now, before I go any further, I just want to clarify. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Republican. His father was, but MLK Jr. was an independent. He supported Democrats like the Kennedys and Lyndon Johnson for all their hard work in the area of civil rights, but he did not support Republicans, with the possible exception of Eisenhower. Alright, moving on. Following Martin Luther King Jr.'s death in Memphis, Tennessee, Bobby Kennedy becomes the new leader of King's movement in the civil rights movement. Following King's death, Bobby gives a speech to basically keep blacks from violently attacking whites and creating a race war. He told the blacks and whites that the best way to combat hate is through unity and love. And he carried that through his presidential campaign, where he promised new reforms in civil rights that would further advance civil rights of African Americans to the level of equality towards whites. Now, we never got that because Kennedy was killed and Nixon became president. Following the death of Robert F. Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey becomes the Democratic nominee, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, and Nixon is the Republican nominee. Now, those Dixiecrats who did not become Republicans, they formed the American Independence Party and ran George Wallace as their presidential candidate. He was more racist. Now, a hot-button issue of the election was the Vietnam War. Kennedy wanted to get us out, and Humphrey was planning on doing peace negotiations as well. And what was Wallace's position? A more hawkish position and prolonging the Vietnam War. But the big thing Wallace was campaigning on was resegregation, while Humphrey was complete desegregation like Kennedy. Nixon basically met in the middle, siding with Wallace, and that is why he did the Southern strategy and said, I'm the law and order candidate, which the racist Southern whites means lock those blacks up. And there is no way in hell that Wallace's supporters would support the party that passed the Civil Rights Act. I mean, that Confederate flag says it all. Now, as you can see, Nixon lost the Solid South, not to Hubert Humphrey, but to George Wallace. I know, Prager, you will say, but Nixon lost the Solid South. Yes, Prager, but to who? To who? He didn't lose it to his Democratic opponent. He lost it to George Wallace. Now, Humphrey did win Texas. That's his home state, and that's LBJ's home state. But now let's look at his next election. Oh, you see that? The Southern strategy worked. The goal of the Southern strategy was to win over the South without alienating the North, because that's exactly what Goldwater did in '64. Goldwater alienated the North by calling civil rights unconstitutional. And considering that the North is where the overwhelming support for civil rights was, it was a bad move. Now, some will cite the 1976 election as proof that the party switch never happened. Carter won the South. Well, Carter, for one, was a Southern governor, but there was a bigger issue with 1976. This was after Nixon had resigned and Ford had pardoned him. Another thing, Ford did not run the Southern strategy. He had felt that Nixon had done his work in winning over Southern voters. But he didn't, because Carter was a Southern governor. So he looked and sounded like Southerners, even though Carter ran on a very strong pro-civil rights campaign. And he had promised a lot. And in fact, Carter dedicated a significant amount of his presidency to improving African American rights. But since Ford did not reach out to Southern voters voted for a Southerner. So anyone tries to mislead you with 1976, remind them that Carter was the governor of Georgia. But 1980, Reagan ran that Southern strategy hard. He race baited that entire election. He made his first campaign stop after the Republican primary in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers were killed, and their killers were never brought to justice. He gave the states' rights speech, which empowered racists in Mississippi. And he continued to run that Southern strategy in 1980, and then brought it on hard. And that is why Carter only won Georgia with 2 northern states. The other one is Minnesota. Which was run by Walter Mondale in 1980. Reagan ran the Southern strategy in 1984 as well. And he continued to race bait with terms like welfare queens. Now, Reagan was an actor, so he could convincingly play the role of a racist, and then a champion of civil rights in northern states. Again, that was the goal of the Southern strategy. In 1988, George H.W. Bush ran his famous Willie Horton ad campaign to basically get racist white Southerners to vote for him. It was his method for the Southern strategy. Willie Horton was a black convicted criminal that was brought up during the 1988 election. Bush used Horton's case to vilify Democrats and paint them as the anti-law and order party, and even floated the idea that Horton was going to be Dudakis's running mate. Now, that was all bogus, but Bush and Atwater, that didn't stop Bush and Atwater from trying to reach out to racist Southern white voters. And that is why the South votes Republican, is because the Republicans reach out to them. Oh, I know what's coming up next. Robert Byrd. He reformed, you guys. But David Duke has not. And he continues to support and hate racism. Also, Republicans are apologists for the Confederacy and wave a Democrat's flag. And yet the parties didn't switch. Now I could talk about what a racist Donald Trump is and how Reagan and Bush's and Nixon's Southern strategy brought him into the party. I could talk about Jeff Sessions, Roy Moore, Russell Walker, Arthur Jones, the list goes on. But I'm going to compare two guys. And if you've been watching this channel, you know who the Republican is, and you know who the Democrat is. So, that's right, you guessed it. The Democrat is progressive Bernie Sanders from Vermont, and the Republican is conservative Sam Brownback from Kansas. And wait till you get a load of their ratings. So, Bernie Sanders has a 93% from the American Civil Liberties Union, 100% from the Human Rights Coalition, and a 97% from the NAACP. What does Sam Brownback have? He has a 20% from the ACLU, has 0% from the HRC, and a 7% from the NAACP. You want to know what I have to say to that? Of course! The guy who spent his entire life fighting for equal rights has a higher approval rating from civil rights groups than a Christian fundamentalist right-wing zealot like Brownback. Of course. But I know you right-wingers will put your tinfoil hats on and try to find out some reason why that is, instead of just accepting reality. Now, the current Democratic Party, I will say, was given birth to in the 80s when Bill Clinton and the Democrats sold themselves off to the private interest groups that funded the Republicans. And that's why the current Democratic Party is a Republican-like party. That's the final party. Anyways, that's why I walked away from the Republican Party. Definitely walk away from the Republican Party. I got another reason in another video, but definitely walk away from the Republican Party. I wish we could walk away from the two-party duopoly, but as long as the odds are stacked against third parties, we can't. Like, share, subscribe. I talk about politics and entertainment. And subscribe.